Well, anyway, thanks for coming yourself. I want to start. I have a small question and I have a big question. Small question is simple. How did you get involved with the Material Girl video directed by Mary Lambert?
They called me up.
Why do you think they asked you? What do you think they needed from you?
I don't know. I mean, I was requested by her ladyship and and Mary Lambert, the director. They had both, apparently I was their first choice to play the part. This sort of Howard Hughes-esque character who's supposed to be this mysterious, wealthy owner of the studio for which she is one of their stars. There was something about what I'd done, I guess, that they saw that they thought was right for this. So they called me up and I said, yeah, sure, what the heck.
Right. Well, I asked that because who wouldn't?
Well, actually, there are a few people that might not.
Yeah. It seems that throughout your career, people seem to think you stand for something, and at certain points in your career, you stand for different things. But in this and many other things, you seem to stand for a kind of purity or a sense of morality, whereas in other times you're quite evil, quite sneaky. And you're not on trial here, but I have some character references I found. There's a current article on American Film about you based on Ballad of the Sac Cafe, where the author Wolf Schneider says, Carradine relishes a full day on the ski slopes, sews a top-notch kid-sized Spider-Man costume, saddles a horse deftly and rides easily, and hasn't raised his voice at his agent once in their 7-year relationship. Another reference I found, that people in your family apparently describe you as the white sheep of the Carradine family. And you're now on Broadway playing the man who was famous for saying, I never met a man I didn't like. And here's the New York Times 2 weeks ago, The Tall Truths of a Yarn Spinner, a great American legend. What reviews I found of the Will Rogers Follies seem to be confusing you with Will Rogers and saying you're just the right person in a kind of moral sense as well as acting ability to do it.
It's a little weird.
Yeah. Well, that's you. And then I found a quote from Joan Tewksbury, who wrote Nashville, which we're going to see next, a clip from it, where she said she based one of the characters in the movie on you. It's not the character you play. It's the character of Kenny, who's the mild-mannered, very pleasant young guy who turns out to be the assassin. But she said, here's the reason why she chose it. She said that you are one of the most genuinely kind human beings I think I've ever known in my life. Nevertheless, you've played Tom, a self-absorbed folk rock singer, composer who's come to Nashville to record an album, but he's also just decided to break off from this famous trio he's been a part of. Did that feel like, did you have any kind of personal associations with Tom for that part?
That was one of the most difficult characters I've ever had to play, because particularly at that point in my career, I was, I guess, about 5 years, only 5 years into my professional career. Still pretty young and very insecure about myself in many ways, about my own, the true nature of my own character, whatever that was. So playing someone like him felt dangerous to me. I was worried about being associated with someone like that. I was worried that people would think that was what I was really like. And it made me very uncomfortable to play him. I didn't like him.
Really? Yeah.
But you know, that's where Altman was so smart, because what he got was, on screen, he got someone who didn't like himself.
Well, here is Tom. We've got the little clip from Nashville, one of the more famous moments. You still get royalties on that song?
Yeah.
Really? Good.
I think I just made 3 or 4 cents right there.
How did you come to the attention of Robert Altman?
Kind of in a typical way. I mean, I had an agent who was trying to get me started, and he knew about this picture that was being put together at Warner Brothers, which was McCabe and Mrs. Miller. And he had talked to the producer and said, you know, there's a part in here for this young cowboy that's supposed to come to town, and it says that he plays the banjo, and I've got this client who plays the banjo. And then he called me up and told me about it, and I said, I don't play the banjo. And he said, well, he said, you better learn, you know. And it was some time went by, and eventually they arranged a meeting, and it was with Altman at his offices in Westwood, and I went to the office, and they said, "Oh yeah, Bob's upstairs. Just go up those stairs and take that door there." And I walked up, knocked on the door. His voice said, "Come in." I walked in, and it was a bedroom, and he was standing there opening up this box and pulling out this pre-Columbian sculpture that he just brought back from, he'd been to the Cartagena Film Festival in Colombia, and he was opening up this sculpture, and I was just about 6 months out of having done Hair on Broadway, and at that point my hair was down to about here. And he took a look at me and he said, "Well," he says, "so what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I just finished doing this Hair, and I just finished doing a movie my first movie with Kirk Douglas and Johnny Cash." And he says, "Well, we're going to do this thing up in Vancouver." He says, "It's not much of a part, but you want to do it?" Couldn't believe my ears. I said, "Well, yeah."
Right.
And he said, "Well, your hair is pretty long." And I said, "Oh, yeah." Because in those days I thought it was important to have it, my hair. And he said, "Well, okay." He says, "Why don't you come on up and play it?" And that was that. And that's the way he works, and it kind of spoiled me because I didn't have to perform for him. I didn't have to do a reading or anything. But he basically casts behavior, and he'll look at a person and decide whether or not they possess the qualities that he's looking for. And that was the beginning of our relationship, And I went up to Vancouver and showed up on the set, and he says, "Come on in here." And he took me into this room and sat me down in a chair, and he said, "Okay." And this guy pulled out the scissors, and my face just must have fallen. I went ashen, And he said, "Hey, listen, kid," he said, "if that's where your ego is, it's in the wrong place."
Right.
Made a lot of sense. So.
There's a kind of myth about Robert Altman's directing style that his sets were free-floating, free-form, filled with a lot of improvisation, very lax and casual. Did you experience that, or do you think that's a miscalculation?
Well, I think that's a misimpression that is created by his work process. When he rehearses, when he's putting the scenes together, he encourages improvisation, if that's what you like to do. If you're not comfortable with that, then he would just as soon you stayed with the script. But he does encourage improvisation in that regard. And when you're working out the scene and when he's staging it and deciding where he's going to put his camera, then he encourages that kind of freedom and a maximum of input from the actors, whatever they feel about the words that are being said, how they want to move, all of that. And then once everyone's comfortable, then he sets it, and it stays pretty much the same. So the improvisations aren't really happening on camera.
You were fairly new to the business then, but did that feel comfortable for you, or were you kind of scared about having to?
It scared me to death. I mean, I wanted to be told what to do. I was very nervous about it. I felt completely at sea if I was having to just sort of make up, because I hadn't studied, I hadn't gone to acting classes where you sort of do that as an exercise on a regular basis. So it was all very foreign to me, I preferred sticking with what was scripted, and that was fine. I mean, that was, he didn't discourage that either.
Yeah, Nashville was quite a celebrated project because it was perceived as being his big bicentennial statement, kind of a big judgment on America, and at the same time he also used the Nashville scene, which was getting to be fairly popular among a wider public at the time, as a skeleton, as a framework. And he asked many of the cast members to write their own songs. And of the various Oscar nominations for Nashville, the only winner was you for that song. You got the Best Song Oscar, which is something you're still ahead of Paul McCartney and Prince and Paul Simon in that respect.
Oh, my God. It's a dubious achievement, right. That.
But and backstage after the Oscars, I discovered you admitted that you'd written the song 3 years before.
I wrote it when I was 19, actually. It was long before.
Yeah.
I wrote it in 1969 when I was living in New York. Yeah.
Did the appearance in Nashville, which is fairly central and fairly significant, did that do anything for your career, for your image? Did people start looking to you for a certain kind of character, a certain kind of
image? Sure, immediately. As soon as you succeed in Hollywood, that's all they want you to do, is what you did in that movie.
Yeah.
So it was a very dicey time for me in terms of trying to figure out how to establish an identity for myself in the community. Of course, what I did very successfully was establish a non-identity, which is really the hard way to go, because if they can't pigeonhole you, if they can't say, well, he's such and such, then they don't know what to do with you, and as a result, they don't do anything with you, you know, basically, which has as much to do with my career being outside the mainstream as anything. I worked very hard not to repeat myself, you know, and, you know, I can't tell you how many scripts I got handed that all started with some guy with a guitar on his back walking down a dirt road, you know. Oh, Keith Carradine part, you know. I said, no, you don't understand. That's not me at all. That's just something I did in this movie, you know. Or play the womanizer over and over again, you know. In fact, it was kind of dangerous because I went right in to do Welcome to L.A. with Alan Rudolph. And that was perceived by many to be a replication of this character, when it was actually the opposite, the perfect opposite. This was someone, Tom Frank was someone who used everyone that he came in contact with, particularly the women. And the character in Welcome to L.A. was someone who allowed himself to be used by every woman with whom he came in contact. So it was the exact opposite, which was why I was excited by the role. I thought it would be kind of a, you know, an inside joke to do that, but nobody got it but me.
Well, speaking from the point of view of the audience, I can't speak for half of the people in America, but the other half seems to think that seems to have thought that you were easy, that you kind of had this large following of adoring female fans from this point on. Did that truly happen? I mean, many people I know say, "Oh, Keith Carradine." The women I know, they swoon, you know, whatever. Did you notice that?
You're getting me into a very weird area here.
Okay.
What I did notice was that because of the success of my music in the movie, I was handed a recording contract by David Geffen in Asylum Records. And I went in and recorded. And in fact, ABC Records, who was in charge of the soundtrack album for Nashville, didn't like my song and thought it had no potential for a radio play. So they reluctantly released it as a single, but they did not promote it whatsoever. So that as a result, when the song won the Academy Award, you couldn't find it in a record store. And by that time, I was already talking to Geffen and had decided to go ahead and record with them. Well, of course, the morning after the Oscars, ABC was calling me up saying, well, we want to do your album. And I said, forget it, guys, you know.
You had your chance.
You had your chance. So I went to record with Geffen, and as a result of doing 2 albums on Asylum, I went out on the road and toured. And on those tours, I was approached a lot. And I had a relationship with Christina Raines, the dark-haired girl there in the movie, and she and I had been living together for a number of years, so I was not, you know, I wasn't that guy. I was, you know, I was not a philanderer. But, and it was what was real interesting was how many of these, you know, people were disappointed by that. They wanted me to be that guy.
Well, let's talk about this other guy. Alan Rudolph is described as not only being an Altman protege, but kind of an unsung hero during Nashville, especially coordinating the logistics of a cast that's really 24 featured actors. And then your next project was his debut film, Welcome to L.A., where you play this composer who's just come back to Los Angeles after living in London for 3 years. We have a short scene in here with Geraldine Chaplin, whom you did many good movies with. Let's see that little clip first. Well, I want to talk about Alan Rudolph because he's a little bit of Robert Altman's style, but definitely works from a different perspective, especially because he writes so much of what he does, and there's some great dialogue there. The background to this story was that it's based on this song cycle by Richard Baskin. And Baskin himself, there seems to be a parallel in the story. Baskin is heir to the Baskin-Robbins ice cream, and your character, who is the songwriter, is the heir to a dairy fortune.
Yes.
Did Rudolph try to make that a real deliberate connection based on Baskin's experience?
It was all intentional.
So Baskin had gone through an experience kind of like your character does in the story?
Yeah, he'd been to England and he'd spent some time there and he'd come back, and it was fairly autobiographical from Richard's point of view, and he and Alan, you know, collaborated on the screenplay in terms of that kind of, you know, information and tying things together with Richard's music.
Yeah. Now, did the cast listen to these songs as part of the preparation for doing the movie? Were you aware of the information they were going to give to the story? Yeah, I mean, they were an integral part of the piece, so, yeah,
I'm not sure about the cast listening to them, but I obviously spent a great time, a great deal of time listening to Richard's music. Yeah.
It also strikes me that it's an interesting group of people involved because you and Geraldine Chaplin, obviously second generation Hollywood. John Considine's in it. His father had been a director. Alan Rudolph's father, I believe, had been a TV director. Did you have a sense that you were trying to kind of reinvent some of the Hollywood tradition there? I mean, did you talk about growing up in show business families?
Not much. We didn't actually talk about it. I think it was probably just basically pure and simple nepotism, you know. I mean, it was, you know, it is and it isn't. I mean, it's like, you know, you grow up with a carpenter and you wind up being a carpenter. I mean, it's kind of all the same thing, you know. There just seems to be sort of an inexorable force that draws you into it. I've never actually had that conversation with Alan, you know, about growing up in Hollywood. It's funny, you know, when you're with people that are from your same situation, you don't need to talk about it.
Right.
The only people that want to talk about it are people that don't know anything about it, you know. So that's, you know, when you're in those situations, you tend not to have that conversation. I'd known Richard for years before. We were in an acting class together, like 10 years before, no, 5 years before, 6 years. Anyhow, like in 1968, something like that, there was a workshop, an actor's workshop that I was in for about 3 months before I went to New York to do hair. And Richard had been in there. So I'd known him from then, but we never talked about, you know, how any of us wound up doing what we were doing. It was just sort of a given.
I did talk to you once before on the phone while The Moderns was coming out, and you had said Rudolph's method is basically, listen, we're all terribly lucky to be doing this for a living, so we might as well enjoy it while we're doing it. Is that the kind of atmosphere you think gets you going best, or are there other directors' approaches that have also encouraged you to do good work?
No, I've never subscribed to the anxiety breeds genius school of, you know, I've always thought that was kind of an indulgence. I have very little patience with, you know, actors who put everyone else through the horrors, you know, so that they can get to what they need to get to. I think it's just kind of bad manners, really.
So it's fairly lucky for you that you started out with these laid-back guys.
Well, in a way. I mean, the fact is that, you know, people who are happy can do wonderful work, you know.
Yeah.
I mean,
Why not?
you know. And sounds kind of simplistic, doesn't it? But it's true. I mean, and I've been very fortunate in my own career in that I've only really once worked with a director who was truly miserable and who made everyone around him truly miserable.
What movie was that?
That was The Bachelor.
Oh, well, we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
In the same year, you also did another debut picture for Ridley Scott, The Duelist. So you got to travel, got to wear some great costumes. This is based on a story by Joseph Conrad about two men who have a lifelong feud, largely sparked by the other man, not your character, over some insult that he feels has affected him, and it goes on for many years. Harvey Keitel was the other man.
Actually based on a true story.
Really? Oh.
Yeah, we didn't know this until Ridley had scouted locations, you know, in various parts of France, and finally settled on this place called Sarlat, which is in the Dordogne region of France. And we all arrived in Sarlat and were invited to a reception at the mairie, which is sort of the town hall. And we went into the town hall, and there was a portrait hanging on the wall of a character by the name of Fournier, who was the model of Harvey Keitel's character in the movie. And in fact, Joseph Conrad, who had presented this short story among his collected works as simply another piece of his fiction, had lifted it almost verbatim from an account from 18th century France about this incident that took place. And this guy named Fournier, who was this notorious firebrand, had you know, carried on this duel with this other guy. And Fournier was a member of the lower class who had risen through the ranks of the military to achieve officer status. And so he had an automatic axe to grind against anyone who was of the aristocracy and had arrived at their officership through, you know, the traditional channels, which is what my character represented.
Well, we have a little clip from there. It begins with a little bit of statement of principle, and then there's a great action sequence here. We're going to show that.
That was a good one. I like that movie.
I should add that this comes from the middle of the story, that the feud continues for several more years, including going to Russia, where Napoleon's armies are in defeat. I have a quick question here. Ridley Scott is well known for liking fog. And the scene starts in the fog, and then you're riding out in full sunlight. There were a lot of smoke machines at the sides of the set as you were doing that scene, do you recall?
This movie was made for $1.2 million. There were no smoke machines.
Really?
There was a guy with a bee smoker running around.
Great.
It was hilarious. I mean, there would be mornings when there was a sequence at the very end sequence in the film is a duel between the two of us, a pistol duel. Mm-hmm. And there's a wonderful wide shot of this beautiful valley and this fog drifting through. And there's a special effects man out there who almost had a heart attack that day. He spent so much time running back and forth. He must have run 10 miles that day trying to make Ridley happy.
Yeah. You were describing how the camera operator, there was a director of photography who was still on the job, but there was a camera operator who left or quit or something. So Ridley Scott took over as a camera operator.
Yeah, I think it was kind of an agreement between the two of them. Ridley wanted him to go, and he went.
So then he effectively directed from the camera.
Yes.
Did you find that comfortable, or was it?
I found it a little disconcerting. I don't think it would bother me as much now. I'm a bit further along, and I know what I'm about a little bit more. So, but at the time, it was a little disturbing because I thought that Ridley, since he was operating, he would be looking at more than just what the actors were doing. Ordinarily, a director is watching the performances and is relying upon the rest of his technical staff to keep an eye on other things. But when he's directing through the camera, it meant that he was, having to pay attention to whether the shot was working, if anything was interfering with the shot, physically or mechanically, as well as watching what the performances were and watching what the actors were doing and deciding whether or not they were delivering what he was going to need.
Yeah. Were you? Was that the only part you were offered, or was there a chance that you might have played the other part?
I was never considered for Harvey's part. No.
Yeah. He's another kind of moralist, especially. He's almost a little priggish in his way, the way Harvey Keitel is in his extreme way. Did you enjoy that aspect of that character? That he has such strong principles?
Of my character?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when you're playing someone that's that centered, it gives you a great foundation to play from, and there's it makes things easier because there's no ambiguity about what his position is, and therefore what the basis of his emotion might be in any given moment.
You know how he's going to react in any given situation.
Pretty much, because he's stuck. I mean, he's stuck between his morality and his sense of honor.
Did you do much of the horse riding there?
Yeah, I did all of it except the jump over the wagon. I had actually been taking lessons for months to do that jump. And I could have done it, but in movies they say. As it turned out, they let the other guy do it. And then we went back to shoot the other stuff, the riding through the trees. And we did a lot of those run-bys, and until my horse was pretty well tired out. So they put me on a new horse that I'd never been on. And that horse immediately took me into a walnut tree. I spent the night in the hospital and 10 days on crutches. So.
Wow. So shooting had to be delayed, or?
Well, the French, they don't cut their horses, They were stallions, both of them. So they tend to be a handful.
Had you been on horses much before? You've done some
I'd done a lot of riding. I've done even more since. I love horses. I have my own horses now. But it's I love movies that I like films that are made outdoors, and especially films where I get to be on a horse. It's my idea of heaven. It really is.
Well, we got another outdoors movie, not a horse scene, but you ride a horse in this movie, the famous Brother Project of the Long Riders, widely hailed as having 4 combinations of brothers in here: the Quades, Carradines, Guests, and Keaches.
And the Keaches. You couldn't be in this movie if you didn't have a brother.
Right. Why don't we see the little clip here first? It's a scene where your character, Jim Younger, who's one of the younger brothers, stands up to some Pinkerton men who have been sent out. It's the first inclination that the gang has that they're being followed or being sought, hunted down. There's a big reward on their heads. Let's see the clip first.
Everybody loves an outlaw.
Even among the outlaws, you were kind of, you at least got to be a ladies' man a little bit, and you had a kind of sense of at least some kind of justice there, avenging your cousin's innocent death.
Is that what that was?
Well, a little bit.
I thought it was just more gratuitous violence.
Well, that is my question. But you haven't been in a lot of violent films, but you did make 2 of these films with Walter Hill and have been in some action scenes. What's your feeling about participating in films that turn out to be fairly violent on screen? Did you enjoy doing that after the fact? You realize that maybe you might not have been associated with that if you'd known how it would turn out?
Well, there's no way I wouldn't have been associated with that one. I mean, I just thought it was a classic tale, and it's about, sort of American semi-icons, the James Younger gang, and the opportunity to work with my brothers, which, doesn't happen all that often because when you put us all together, it's kind of hard for us to play anything but brothers. The other film that I did with Walter, Southern Comfort, I thought was a wonderful allegorical, Vietnam allegory. And it had a statement to make, So I felt that, there was a certain justification to what violence there was, although I tend to think that Walter always overdoes it. But that's his trademark. The only thing that, my only prerequisite is that if it's a film I'd go to see, and I don't tend to go to those movies. I don't tend to go to violent films. I don't have those kind of appetites. I'd rather see people make love than kill each other. But it depends on what the root of it is, what the basis of it is, and what the ultimate feeling or message is that people are going to take with them when they leave the theater. Film is so powerful as a medium. It has such a power to influence people's thinking that there's a responsibility that attaches to that. So.
What do you feel people would have been left with in as long riders?
Well, I would think that, it's been a while since I've sat and kind of watched the movie, but I would think that, the futility of choosing a course like the one that was chosen by those people, and that whatever glory one might perceive in that, it's a false glory. It's hollow.
Yeah, even the scene begins with your cousin kind of saying he wishes he could be part of this, and you're more or less saying you don't need it.
It's pitiful.
Yeah.
What he says is pitiful.
Yeah. Was it fun to do this, having all the brothers together, or did it get really complicated?
That was great. It was great. It was like 16 weeks of adult summer camp. It was. I can't describe it any better than that. It was like a boyhood dream come true. I mean, my God, to get up every day and strap on your 6 gun and you put on your duster and go out and ride,
Well, let's.
And they paid us.
Yeah. Let's talk about family a little bit. I've read that your brother David wanted to audition for Harry, brought you as his accompanist, and you ended up getting the job.
Yeah.
And you went to Broadway to be in the kind of a second generation of the first production on Broadway in Hair. You talked earlier about being in the movies as kind of inexorable. Did you always have that feeling, or did you really question whether or not you might want to be an actor? Was there something else you might have done?
I had a secret desire to do it as long as I can remember, but I didn't dare admit it because I was afraid of, my motives being questioned. There were other things because I knew that I had a knack in certain areas. I had an artistic touch. I was good in art classes in school, whatever that means. I could draw. I knew I was musical. I started picking up instruments and learning them on my own. When I was like 12, 13 years old, I started with the harmonica, then the guitar, and then the piano. And so there were a number of areas that I felt I could have gone into. And I suppose the ultimate reason I chose acting was because it did not preclude anything else. Being an actor doesn't mean you have to stop playing the guitar.
Right.
But if you're going to be a full-time musician, or a full-time painter, then it sort of means that that's what you have to do to the exclusion of everything else. The wonderful thing about acting is that every time you take on a new role, it's going to take you into areas and perhaps even certain skills, manual or other, that you might need to play that part. So it's a continuing kind of education.
Yeah. Well, your father, almost sounds like you're kind of reliving some of your father's experience. And he's John Carradine, one of the great character actors, great actors in American movies. We have a picture of him, I believe. And apparently, your grandparents, his parents, his father was an attorney, poet, painter, and your grandmother was a surgeon, and your father was born in Greenwich Village. This is all correct?
Yes.
Amazing. And your father started out as a painter and sculptor, also a dairy farmer, and designed sets for Cecil B. DeMille. You were talking about how your father was an itinerant portrait painter or sculptor or both.
He was a sketch artist. He would do portrait sketches, and he sort of worked his way across the country in the early years of the Great Depression by drawing people's portraits.
And he ended up in Louisiana, apparently.
Yeah, he had been in New Orleans, and he was kind of working his way west. And I think his last stop was Shreveport, and he told me that he spent some time there and lived at the Y. And drew people's pictures until he'd sort of run out of clients. And everyone had their picture drawn. And his offer was, for $1 I will draw your portrait. And if you don't consider it a good likeness, you can have it for nothing.
Wow, good way to live.
And he never had anybody take it for nothing. See the film in February, and to be there to promote its release. And I hugged him after the screening. I said, Roberto, you're a pain in the ass, but you made a beautiful movie. I mean, it's really wonderful.
But maybe we should explain a little bit about it. It starts out seeming fairly moribund, but it ends up being fairly satirical, very funny.
Oh yeah, well it's vintage Schnitzler. If anyone's familiar with his work, Le Ronde being something that he wrote. It's wonderful. When Freud was writing clinically about his psychological studies, Schnitzler was writing about the same things only in fiction, and he was putting it into fictional stories. And it's a wonderful, fascinating character study. This guy is, he's a piece of work. And it's a wonderful film, and it's an engrossing film, and he's kind of on an emotional adventure through the thing that, and at the end it's very, the satire is quite rich, and it's very amusing.
You get to wear all those great clothes, too. Linen
Not
suits
to mention.
Yeah. What do you think that foreign directors seem to see in you? You've worked with so many. Sometimes you play American, sometimes you play foreign characters. Do they ever say why they pick you?
Yeah, but I never remember. Maybe on purpose I don't remember, because I'm afraid I'll edit myself in some way or something,
Do you feel that they think you're so ultra-American in some cases, maybe, or?
I don't think that's it. I think it's something else, because I don't think they do consider me ultra-American, and I guess it depends on what work I've done that they've seen, I mean, some of my work has been very kind of, it's been very kind of middle of the country, the people that I play, but there are other instances where I'm playing people that are very outside the mainstream, and personally, I don't know what I am. I mean, I grew up in California, and I had a very normal childhood, as normal as it can be, being the son of, a character actor. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean. Yeah.
Well, now your latest film is it's almost a European film. It's based on a great American book, and it's set in America and all that, but it's got an English director, the actor Simon Callow, and it's got Vanessa Redgrave playing an American. The Ballad of the Sad Cafe. How did you come to be involved with that?
Well, I was told, once again, that it was out there. My agent called me up and said, here's this film, are you interested? And I said, yeah, let me read it. And I read it, and I said, you bet I'm interested. I think it's a terrific script, and I already knew that Vanessa was going to be involved. And she said, yeah, I'd love to do it. And he said, okay. And then I didn't hear anything for 2 weeks. And then I finally called him, and I said, what's going on with Ballad of the Sad Cafe? And he says, well, they're using Sam Shepard. I said, oh, okay. And I forgot about it, and then about a month after that, he called me back and he said, I have good news and I have bad news. And I said, what's that? He said, well, the good news is that they want you for a movie, and the bad news is it's Ballad of the Sad Cafe again. And I said, oh, that's back. Well, what happened? And I said, well, apparently Sam couldn't do it. He was exhausted or something. And so I had mixed feelings about it, because on the one hand I thought, I was desperate to play the part. I thought it was a fabulous role, and I thought I'd love to work with Ms. Redgrave, and everything about the project appealed to me, but now I was kind of insulted.
Right.
But finally, my good sense overcame my ego, and I chose to do it.
Well, your character is Marvin Macy, the man who's kind of responsible for Vanessa Redgrave's character's problem, and then who comes back in the latter roughly third of the movie. Here's a scene.
I'm not sure who's responsible for what.
Well,
here.
you're right,
I'm not going to sit back and let you say I'm responsible for her.
Let's not
problem.
put blame anywhere. Either way. But here's a scene where that you have with her, and also with Kirk Hubbard, who's her cousin, possibly. A scene of confrontation, really, where you also get to play the guitar.
He's a sweetheart.
You mentioned getting to work with Max von Sydow and some of the other greats you worked with. Rod Steiger's in here, and of course Vanessa Redgrave. Did it turn out to be as enjoyable as you thought it would be to work with her?
Every bit, more
Yeah.
so.
Mm-hmm.
She's phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
She's one of the great actresses of our time.
Mm-hmm. And the character, he's got some other dimensions here.
Oh, he's got a lot of layers because when you meet him, he's kind of the town ne'er-do-well, and then he falls inexplicably and completely in love with Amelia. And in an effort to win her, changes his ways utterly and completely, and is accepted by her, and then rather immediately spurned by her, which then forces him into, or is the catalyst for him to take this journey to the other side of love.
What do you think if Marvin Macy here met that young cowpoke from McCabe and Mrs. Miller, what kind of a conversation do you think they might have?
Very short. Very short. They wouldn't have much to talk about.
Well,
Marvin never met a man who liked him.
the film's been getting some good responses, and I wonder if you read the press on yourself.
I don't avoid it, but I don't seek it out. The trouble with press is it's always one person's opinion, and sometimes that person's opinion might have great worth because of their background, because of their intellect, because of their however much they know about the process itself, and it could be instructive. Other times, it can be very destructive if it's based on things that shouldn't be important. But we're all vulnerable, and so criticism is a delicate thing for a performer. Sometimes it can help you, and it can help you to grow. Other times it can really be stifling, and it can really kind of shut you down. So the trouble with it is that if you're going to believe the good stuff, then you kind of have to believe the bad too. So I just as soon take it all with about the same grain of salt, and as a result, I don't look to find it, to read it. Sometimes it's unavoidable. People are constantly shoving it under your nose, saying, "Look at this."
Yeah.
But,
well, at the moment, of course, we can't avoid some of the talk about the Will Rogers Follies. Let's talk about that a little bit. We've got a picture of you being Will Rogers here. I don't know if there you are. It's your father played Lincoln. Your brother played Woody Guthrie. Is Robert going to play Bob Dylan or somebody? Here you are playing.
He
Will
could.
Rogers. Yeah. It's nominated for 11 Tony Awards. It's going to open the TV broadcast of the Tonys next Sunday night. It's already won 2 other major awards, the New York Theater Critics Circle and the Drama Desk. How can you explain the concept of the show? It's got kind of an unusual configuration.
The concept is that Will Rogers, who began his show business career, he began as a performer doing a roping act, a trick rope act in Wild West shows. And then from there he went to vaudeville, and he became the only performer in the vaudeville circuit who had a roping act with a live horse on stage. And then one night the horse didn't make it. So he was out there with his rope and nothing to do, and he started talking, and everybody laughed. And then he realized he was funny. Well, he kind of already knew he was funny, but he didn't realize he could do it for an audience. So that became his act, and then he was discovered by Florence Ziegfeld, whose famous Ziegfeld Follies were in New York, and he hired Will, and he eventually became a headliner with the Ziegfeld Follies, and he spent about 10 years as a headliner with the Ziegfeld Follies, and that was what launched him in his show business career, really. So the conceit here is that here it is 1991. How do you tell the story of Will Rogers in a musical on stage? Well, you get Ziegfeld to do it. So the idea is that Florence Ziegfeld has come back from the great beyond, and with him he's brought Will Rogers and other various and sundry people from the performer's life, and he has, in the form of the Ziegfeld Follies, undertaken to tell the story of Will Rogers. So it's the story of his life in a series of of sketches, skits, done in the vein of the Ziegfeld Follies.
And Ziegfeld's present at least as a voice, right? He's
Yes.
not visible.
The voice of Gregory Peck, actually.
Oh, great. And you sing it to the rafters, right? You sing songs, you dance a little?
Yep.
You do the rope tricks?
I do. I spin a few, yeah.
Yeah. How long did it take to get the rope tricks down?
About 3 months of concentrated effort, but I've been working on it since a year ago last December, about.
Yeah. Who taught you?
I took 3 lessons from Gene McLaughlin, who's 3-time world champ, and he lives out in California. He's a trick roper and a movie stunt man, and he had taught my brother Bobby to rope cows for the Cowboys. Bobby's first movie.
Nice.
He's the guy who taught all those kids how to rope cows. So I went to Gene, and he gave me 3 lessons, and now we've got a guy who does. We've got a real world-class roper in the show who's taught me some stuff too.
There's a moment in the show apparently where you do what Will Rogers did, which is you get the day's newspaper,
Yeah.
and you hold it up and you do a little improvisational satire on that day's events. Is that hard to do each day?
Well, it's not. Very little of it is improv.
Uh-huh.
Some of it is improv. There are little asides and things that I make depending on the audience, how they're responding. If they're responding.
Yeah.
And I always start that section of the show with today's headline, whatever it is, and sometimes the headlines will lend themselves to comments. One day I picked it up and I looked, and it said, U.S. military developing secret nuclear-powered missile. I said, well, it ain't a secret anymore, is it? I mean, it's on the front page of the New York Times. I thought that was just hilarious.
Yeah. Well, do you find that that's an opportunity for yourself to inject some commentary as well, or do you feel that you have to be Will Rogers, what he
It's
might
always
say?
in the character of Will,
Uh-huh.
and it's a wonderful place to be, I must say. That's most of the fun of playing this part, is to get into that kind of a mental set for 2.5 hours.
Yeah.
He must have had a ball in his life, that guy.
Yeah.
So to pretend to be him for a couple of hours a night is really fun.
And he was much shorter, wasn't he? He was apparently fairly short.
Yeah, I think he was like 5'10", 5'9", 5'10". I'm 6'1", and I'm pretty thin. He wasn't as thin as I am.
Apparently you're not trying to mimic him exactly.
I couldn't. It would be
Yeah.
foolish to try. I don't try to sound exactly like him. I certainly don't look very much like him. What I try to do is feel like him, and that's what counts. As if the audience is getting a feeling of what it must have been like. I listened to a lot of his radio stuff, and there's recordings that you can get. And I've read. I mean, there's so much written material, that you can get. And I looked at a lot of his movies. One in particular to work on the roping stuff.
Which one is that? Which movie?
It's called The Roping Fool. It's one of the 3 movies that he made with his own money, and he went broke doing it. And it was a silent, but he was one of the first people to employ slow motion as a way of enhancing the stunt that you were looking at. So there were great slow motion sequences of him doing some of his most famous tricks. One of which was the Texas Skip. And I really wanted to do that in the show, and I was having a heck of a time figuring it out until I looked at it in the movie in slow motion, and I realized and I saw there's a timing thing that he was doing that I wasn't getting.
What's the Texas Skip? How do you?
Well, you have a long rope,
Uh-huh.
and you spin a vertical loop.
Uh-huh.
You spin a vertical loop, and then you jump.
Oh yeah. Let's got a cord here. We're on a 1-year contract for Will Rogers, so people can see you. It just barely opened, practically.
Yeah, we opened May
almost
1st.
a year to see you. Yeah. Will it matter to you if you get the Tony? Do awards like that mean something? What we would assume they would mean to you, or?
If I said it didn't matter, I'd be lying.
Uh-huh.
If I admitted how much it matters to me, I'd be foolish.
Uh-huh.
It would be great to win it. I'd love to win it. I don't really hope to. I mean, I hope to, but I'm not holding my breath about it because, I've got some pretty stiff competition.
Yeah.
So I don't really. I think my chances are probably 40-60 at best. The nomination has been a real thrill, and what it's done for the show, all of the nominations that the show has received have been just terrific. I mean, we're a hit, and that's all that matters. I mean, we're sold out, and people love it, and New York has suddenly become a very small town for me. It's the weirdest thing. You're in a town of 8 million people, and you're walking down the street, and people say, "Hiya, Will." It's really weird.
Is it bringing movie offers again? Not again, but no? Is it bringing?
Well, nothing concrete yet, but I've got stuff that I'm working on anyway, that I would have been planning to do after finishing with this in any case. But I would hope that something nice would come out of it. If it doesn't, it may be the first time in 7 years that I've yelled at my agent.
Great.
I'm sorry. I'd like to stay, but I guess I have to go.
Thanks.
Thank you.